Welcome, everyone. I'm really excited for our today's keynote event. My name is Jasmine, and I'll be hosting our today's event. Our society is proudly sponsored by Pivomo, Rate My Placement, Edinburgh Innovations, and Bonnie Burrito. So, for our today's keynote event, I have the privilege of introducing Professor Peter Mathieson, who was born and educated in the United Kingdom, and he went on to a state grammar school in Cornwall and was the first member of family to go to the university. So in first half of the session, Peter Mathieson will talk about his career journey and what leadership roles he undertook throughout his career journey, and what are the key skills and key things we can learn from his journey, and we can ultimately apply that to our personal development. And in the second half of the session, we'll we'll leave the platform open for all our members so that they can ask any questions on the chat. So please feel free to drop your questions in the chat box of the Zoom. I extend my warm welcome to the Professor Peter Mathieson, and may I have your permission to start our session, please?
Yes, let me just check I'm not muted. Yes, Jazz, please carry on. So do you want me to just speak?
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'm just setting a timer for 30 minutes because
yes.
I have a tendency to talk too much, and so if the alarm goes off, you'll know that my time's up.
Okay.
Okay, so thank you very much, Jazz, and thanks to Harrison for the original invitation. And I'm very happy to talk about myself. That's what you've asked me to talk about, my career and any sort of observations I have about leadership or about opportunities and things that I had as I went along, and I'm very happy to do that. I don't consider myself terribly interesting, but you know, I do think that there'll be one or two things that I hope will strike a chord with some of your members. In the original email invitation, Harrison mentioned that one of the concerns behind your group was the idea that people might be tramlined into particular careers, or at least in their minds associate a particular degree with a particular career path. And I'd start off by making two remarks about that. One is that because my first degree that I did was in medicine, inevitably that does sort of push you into a particular career path, because that's the nature of the professional degree. And I'll say a bit about why I chose that. But what I would say is that within a medical degree, there's a massive amount of flexibility of what you can do with your degree, and therefore I think the general point does still apply, that actually you're not necessarily pigeonholed into a particular path because of your particular degree. But I'll say a bit more about why I chose to do what I chose. And then the other, I was just going to relate an anecdote. When I think it was when I'd only been here at Edinburgh a very short time, I was at an event of some sort in McEwan Hall, and it was an engineering event. And a student came up to me and said, "Can I ask you a question?" And I said, "Yeah, of course you can." And he said, "I'm really worried because I'm about to graduate with a degree in engineering, and I'm really concerned that I don't know what I'm going to do with it, and I think I'm going to end up only being able to be an engineer, and I'm really worried that I might have shut off all sorts of other opportunities to myself." And that conversation lives in my mind because I was really struck by the fact that he was just about to complete a degree which in my mind is an extraordinarily versatile degree in engineering. And I don't know about anybody on the call, but I mean, I think of engineers as sort of problem solvers and people that identify an issue and work out a way of trying to solve it. And I think that kind of mentality can be applied to almost any walk of life. So I was just really struck by the fact that this person, who to me was graduating in something very flexible and adaptable, was worried that he was going to be pigeonholed. So I just quote that anecdote as an example of the fact that I think people, especially young people like you, are concerned about what they perceive as closing doors to themselves too early in life and leaving only a certain number of doors open. And I think a central part of my message to you this evening will be that you might think you're closing doors, but most of the time you're not. And I mean, look at me, you know, I'm an ordinary schoolboy from Cornwall who ended up doing medicine, and now I end up, you know, principal of one of the world's great universities. So you know, how on earth did that happen? And I suppose that's what I need to tell you about in the next 25 minutes or so. So my surname is a Scottish surname. So Mathieson is a Scottish name. We have a tartan. We have a clan history. We have clan badges and an ancient history going back several hundred years, which I've read a little bit about. As you can tell from the accent, I wasn't brought up in Scotland. My father was born in Edinburgh, and my father was a proud Scot. Most of his early life was in Prestwick on the west coast of Scotland, he was a merchant naval seaman. So he left school at, I think, about 15. It's possibly 14. I'm not sure which. But he went to sea and he worked as a labourer on a merchant naval ship, and he went to deep sea. So he was away from home for very long periods of time for many years of his life. And he married relatively late. He met my mother, who was a nurse. He was quite a bit older than my mother, they met in Harwich, which is a port on the east coast of Essex, on the east coast of England. And the reason that he was there is because by that time he was working with an organisation called Trinity House, and Trinity House was still is an organisation which was responsible for patrolling the coasts of England, particularly looking after lighthouses and lightships and wrecks, wreck buoys and things like that. So marking hazards off the coast of England, if you like. And in the days which I'm old enough to remember, but most of you are not, lighthouses used to have humans on them, running them. They used to have lighthouse keepers. And the lighthouses that were out at sea had to have these people taken out there and brought off when their shift was finished. And that was the job basically that Trinity House did. And my father worked with Trinity House for a number of years, serving that function around the coasts of England. And because of that, we moved quite frequently. So I was born in Colchester. We left Colchester when I was less than a year old, and we moved to Swansea in South Wales. We stayed there for 3 years, and then we moved from Swansea to Penzance in Cornwall. And we moved to those places because those are the places where there were Trinity House depots. And my father's job involved quite frequent changes of which ship he was serving on. And then my father died. He died when I was 7 years old. So I don't have very many memories of him. The reason that I stayed in Cornwall and grew up in Cornwall was because my father died then. If he hadn't died then, we'd have carried on moving, presumably with his work. And I know his ambition was always to end up back in Scotland. So he spent all his working life away from Scotland, but he always had the ambition to come back. Sadly, never lived to see that day. So you can see there's a sort of sentimentality for me about ending up in Edinburgh, because it's where my father was born and it's where he hoped to end up, and he didn't manage it, but maybe I have in some sort of surrogate way completed the circle by coming back here. My mum, so I had one older brother. My mum brought up my brother and I effectively as a single parent for the rest of my childhood. We didn't have much money because my father died. My father wasn't wealthy, but he also died without making a will. And in those days, that led widows to a situation of poverty. There was a possibility that my mum would have been thrown out of the house that she lived in because it wasn't in her name, it was in his name. All of my sort of home life depended on what happened to her when my father suddenly died, because he died suddenly without warning. And that, I remember that was quite a traumatic period, but my mum was a very strong and single-minded individual, and she managed to hold things together, and she brought up my brother and I as best she could. I am very grateful to her for the stability that she provided for us. When I was at school, so I went to a state grammar school, which is again, I'm old, so therefore I did 11 plus, which is an exam some of you might have heard of, but probably never actually took. And it lasted, 11 plus stayed longer in Cornwall than it did most other parts of the UK. And when I was 11 plus was still something that you did. It was probably the first exam I did in my life. I didn't actually know I was doing an important exam because our school didn't tell us. So we just turned up one day and were told we've got a bit of a test to do. So we went and did this test, and none of us realized that it was a sort of potentially life-changing exam because they didn't build it up at that stage into anything significant. I happened to pass that exam, which meant that I qualified for a place in a state grammar school, which I went to in Penzance. When I was at school, the thing I was best at was languages. I used to find languages easy and I used to enjoy them. But I decided when I was about 14, stupidly, I think, but anyway, when you're 14, you often don't really understand the major issues. And I decided that I didn't think I would do languages to A level because, or to O level and then A level, because I didn't think that would lead to any very well-defined career path. So I made this decision that languages, although I was quite good at them, that wasn't going to make me, it wasn't going to be a career for me. With hindsight, that was almost certainly a mistake. I mean, obviously there's lots of careers I could have done with a language, set of language qualifications, but anyway, I decided not to do that. And the only other thing I was any good at was sciences. And so I thought to myself, what can I do with sciences? And I decided around that time that I thought medicine would be a good career for me. I was short of sources of advice. And I think one of the things that people who are first in family to university recognize is that they don't find it easy to know how to get advice, because their parents and sometimes their parents' friends won't necessarily have been to university or have much knowledge about it. And certainly I didn't know anybody. My mum was a nurse, as I said, so I had some idea about healthcare, but she in those days, nursing was something you did straight from school. She hadn't been to university to do a nursing degree or anything like that. And I talked to my school about wanting to do medicine, and my school tried to discourage me. They said, it's very competitive and you know, you might end up disappointed. Don't you think you should aim a little bit lower? And I was very annoyed by that advice, and I decided I'd try and prove them wrong, and I would try and get myself a place in medical school. And I've often wondered in hindsight whether my school gave me that advice because they thought I needed a bit of a kick up the backside to be reminded to get on and do some work. And I think that is a possibility, but I don't know for sure. The only person I was able to get any advice from was my family doctor. I made an appointment to go and see the GP. I went to see the GP on my own without my mum. I was aged about 14 or 15 at the time. And the doctor looked very worried when I walked in and said, "Oh dear, you know, Peter, what's the trouble? You know, why are you here? Why are you here without your mum? What's going on?" And I said, "Oh, don't worry, there's nothing wrong with me. I just wanted to talk to you about medical careers." And my GP was very happy to talk to me about medical careers. And actually, he became quite a useful source of advice for me.
Year 14.
Pardon?
At year 14.
I was aged about 14 at that time, yeah. Because it was when in those days you had to choose your O levels when you're about 14, and your O levels played a major role in choosing what your A levels would later on be. So you had to make quite important decisions at the age of 14.
So do you think, like, given your situation, that sort of made you more responsible than your peers in a way, because you were already thinking about your career than your peers who were just going to the school because they had funding from their family and everything?
Yeah, I mean, I think the people that knew me when I was 14 probably wouldn't describe me as responsible, and I'm not sure that I would necessarily think I was. I mean, I certainly had an idea. I was going to school in Penzance, which is 10 miles from Land's End. It's miles from anywhere. And I sort of felt I wanted to get out. You know, I wanted to go somewhere. I didn't envisage spending my entire life in Cornwall again. I mean, now I love Cornwall now, and ever since I've left Cornwall, I've realized what a nice place it is. But when I actually lived there, I felt as if it was very isolated, and I wanted to get away. So I thought education was going to be a route out for me. And I decided that medicine would be a career I reckoned I would enjoy, and that's what I should try and do. So I ended up applying. I got a place to do medicine. I studied medicine in London. I ended up, as you'll hear, I've got about half a dozen people that I think have really influenced my life path. One of them was that family GP. He was the first one. Another one, in a rather negative sense, was the teacher I spoke to at school who told me that I needed to aim a bit lower. He influenced me as well, but in a very negative way.
Yeah.
I went to medical school, thoroughly enjoyed myself, played rugby at first, but then decided that because rugby was my sport in Cornwall, that was very much the sport, but I decided that I couldn't play rugby, have a social life and do any study. I had to, you know, one of the three had to go, and I decided that I wanted a social life, so I gave up rugby. And I managed to graduate in medicine, having done well in my exams because I found the subject very interesting and stimulating. And then I came across the next person that really influenced me, who was a professor of medicine called Bob Cohen. Bob was He's dead now, but he was the sort of the big name in medicine at the London Hospital, which is where I did my medical degree. And I went to see Bob, and I said to him, so I did my first job after graduation for Bob Cohen, because when you first graduate, you do what's called the pre-registration job. So they're not sort of they're jobs which you're not fully qualified until you've finished it. And during my job, I went to see Bob, and I asked him for career advice, and he said, "My advice to you is to leave." He said, "Don't apply for another job here, because if you apply for another job here, you'll get it, and then you'll end up spending all your life here."
Yeah.
He said, "My advice to you is to go somewhere else." And I thought that was interesting. I didn't know if he wanted to get rid of me or quite what he was, but I think he meant well. And I ended up applying for a job at Hammersmith Hospital, which was a hospital very famous for academic medicine. And I think that choice and that decision to go there basically shaped where I went with my medical career, because I then got bitten by the research bug and by the idea that there's an aspect of medicine which is not just about clinical care, but which is also about teaching and research and academia and whatnot. And I think it was that decision going from the London Hospital, where I'd done my medicine graduation, to the Hammersmith, I think that was a very important determinant for me of what I did next. So then I did basic medical training jobs, and then I went to see another person who influenced me, is a man called Keith Peters. Keith was, he had been at Hammersmith, and he'd moved to Cambridge by this time. And I went to see Keith Peters, and I asked him for some career advice. And his career advice was leave London and come to Cambridge. Again, I sort of portray this as if various elderly white men at various points in my career have influenced me, but there's no doubt that this was another influential conversation where.
So what fascinated you about him, about Keith in particular?
Keith's still alive, and I still talk to him quite regularly. He's in his middle 80s now. He's an interesting character. He's a very charismatic figure who he's very, very loyal. If he likes you and he wants to encourage you, he's very, very loyal. If he doesn't like you, he can be absolutely ruthless and awful to people. But clearly, for some reason, he liked me, and therefore I was sort of on the inside circle with him a bit. So I went to Cambridge. I applied for a grant from the Medical Research Council, went to Cambridge, did a PhD, spent a number of years doing medical research predominantly. I did about 7 years of research, not doing any clinical work, but just doing a bit of teaching. And then I did a bit more clinical work. And then I then went to Bristol, where I became, at that time, the youngest professor of medicine in the country. I was 34 at the time, which is considered young to be a professor of medicine, because obviously in medicine you tend to spend a number of years doing clinical work. So although 34 is not particularly young for a professor generally, it was pretty young for a medical professor. And I'd specialized by that time in kidney medicine, which I won't bore you with the details, but which I happen to think is the most interesting and exciting branch of medicine. And in Bristol, for the first 7 or 8 years I was there, I had what I regard as the perfect job. I did part-time clinical work, I did part-time teaching, and I did part-time research, and I did no administration, and I refused to get involved in any administration. If ever I was asked to take on being a member of a committee or anything else like that, I would say no, because I've got too many other things to concentrate on. And I had a research group that I needed to get funding for, and although I had a job with the university, all the people that worked with me were on insecure funding on research grants, and so making sure that their careers were looked after became a really important priority for me. And so I absolutely refused to get involved in any administration. And then this is where I think the story might get a bit interesting, because in 2002, I think it was, so 18 years ago now, I made what I regard as a terrible mistake. I publicly criticized the head of department that I was working in, because I felt he was screwing it up, and I decided to say so. And the boss of the university said, "Well, if you think you can do a better job, you better become head of department then in that case." So I first of all became deputy head of department, and then a couple of years later I became head of department. And basically everything that's happened to me since has followed on from that choice. I'd previously avoided any kind of administration, any kind of management position. But once you get started on the slippery slope, it's hard then to get off. And I became dean in Bristol. I did that for 6 years. And then I went to Hong Kong, which was the first job where I was doing something beyond medicine. So previously I'd only studied within my, or worked within my sort of area. And then when I went to Hong Kong, obviously I was now in charge of the entire university and in a politically complicated place. I did that for just about 4 years, and then I came here, and I've been here for 2.5 years. So the leadership positions that I've taken on have sort of been a progression, starting with that role of deputy head of department in Bristol, which was the first time that I understood budgets, the first time I understood sort of personnel management. My mother's dead now, but my mother at the time thought I was making a very serious mistake. She thought I was turning my back on my medical career. She knew that medicine and teaching and research were the things that really turned me on. And she said, "Why are you doing less of those and going and becoming a manager, becoming an administrator?" And I used to say to her, "Well, I'll never stop being a physician. I'll never stop being a medical educator. That's what defines me. But it just seems to me that I can do this leadership thing, and I want to be able to make a difference for other people, not just for me, but to sort of lead a department well, because I felt the department that I took over had not been led well, and I felt I could do a better job. So the rest is history, really. That's what's happened to me. I mean, if I was to try and summarize, let me see how many minutes I've got left on my clock. I've still got 10 minutes left. So if I was to sort of summarize the way it's gone for me, I mean, I was the first member of my family to do A levels, let alone go to university. So nobody, my brother and neither of my parents had stayed on at school to do A levels. And so it was all a bit of an adventure for me because I was the first one to do this. I didn't have a lot of sources of advice apart from that family GP that I talked about. And I sort of felt as if I was motivated by really quite superficial considerations. I basically wanted to do something interesting. One of the reasons I decided medicine would suit me was that it did have a very defined career path. And I felt, I could have done, of the A levels I did, the subject I was best at was chemistry, and I could have done a chemistry degree. But I just sort of felt that medicine's got a more defined exit path, and I knew roughly where a medical degree, or at least I thought I knew where a medical degree would take me. Of course, I was completely wrong about that. I mean, I've ended up, I haven't done any medicine now for 6 years. I do a bit of teaching still, and I keep in touch with my research group, but I haven't done any clinical medicine for 6.5 years now. So, here I am, medically qualified, but not medically active. And people often ask me if I miss it. And the answer is, yes, I do. I miss it every day. I miss my patients. I miss the hospital environment. I miss the sort of team ethos that you have, particularly in a kidney unit. Kidney medicine is a fantastically interesting and challenging subject. We used to do kidney transplants, which transform people's lives. I miss all of that, and I do feel that it's a sadness that I don't still do those things. But I wouldn't say I have any regrets about any of the decisions I've made. I don't by nature tend to look back. I tend to try and look forward, and I never wonder what might have been. I always just think, well, I made these choices at the time for whatever reasons, and I'll do my best to make a success of whatever I'm currently doing. So I was pretty superficial in the way I chose my medical degree. Having chosen medicine and then within that chosen kidney medicine, I did throw myself into it with gusto because I was really, really excited by the subjects. And so when people ask me what degree they should do at university, I always give them the same answer, which is I always say to them, do something you're interested in and you'll enjoy, because then you'll do well at it. Don't do something because somebody else advises you that you should do it. So many people, certainly in medicine that I've met, that are unhappy, are often unhappy because they're doing it not because they wanted to do it, because they're doing it because their teachers or their parents or somebody else thought they should do it, and they did it for the wrong reason. So I always tell people, do something that you think will excite you, because if it excites you, then you're going to do well at it. And I certainly apply that to myself. I then did a load of medical research. I had some successes in my medical research career, and I had lots of failures. It's a bit like being an entrepreneur. You learn from your failures. Medical research is a real roller coaster. You have, I've discovered half a dozen interesting things in my research career, probably interesting to me at least. And I've probably had more disappointments in terms of grants that I've applied for or papers that I've submitted than I have successes, because that's a bit the nature of research. So you have lots of failures and you have to learn from your failures, and that's very akin to entrepreneurship, as you all know. And then I then made this move into university leadership, which I've now been doing more or less full time now for about 12 years. And before that, I did it sort of part time for about 5 or 6 years. So I've been doing some part of university leadership for 17 or 18 years. I had the amazing opportunity to work in Hong Kong, which is one of the most incredible places on the planet. It's an exciting city. It's a great place to live. It's complicated. I was there at a very complicated time. I came in for a lot of criticism from both from the pro-establishment and the anti-establishment camp. And one of the characteristics of Hong Kong, and I see 1 or 2 Chinese names on the attendees. They may well ask me questions about Hong Kong, but one of the complications about Hong Kong is it is a divided place with different loyalties and different views about politics. And all I would say about my time in Hong Kong is that I was never interested in being a politician. All I wanted to do was try and run the university as best I could. And I always did what I thought was in the best interest of the university. Sometimes people agreed with me and sometimes they didn't, but my motivation was pure. I wanted to do what was best for the university. Whilst living and working in Hong Kong, my wife was there with me. My kids are both grown up, and so they didn't come with us. But my wife was in Hong Kong with me, and we had a most amazing set of experiences. I mean, we didn't have a lot of leisure time because Hong Kong is a very 24/7 sort of place. So I worked hard whilst I was there, including most weekends. But we met really interesting people. You know, Hong Kong has a number of very wealthy philanthropists, many of whom are willing to donate money to education, to schools and to universities. And so I met with billionaires, and grammar school boys from Penzance don't often get to meet billionaires. So I often used to sort of pinch myself and say, could this really be happening to me? But it was. I had political adventures, you know, beyond your imagination. I met with the senior levels of the Beijing government. I met with the senior levels of the American government. I met with the senior levels of the British government. I was in Hong Kong is just one of those places that convenes world powers, and I was running the oldest university in Hong Kong and the only English language university the only comprehensive English language university in Greater China, and it was a position which I regard as a great privilege. And I had fantastic experience there. When I got the chance to come to Edinburgh, my initial reaction was that I wasn't interested because I had a perfectly good job in Hong Kong and I didn't need another job at that time. But the clever thing that these headhunters did when they talked to me about this job was they said, just go visit Edinburgh, and then make up your mind. And as all of you will know, once you visited Edinburgh, there is a sort of captivation to the place that I partly magic for me because of the point I made earlier on about my father, but also because Edinburgh is just such a fantastic city and the university's got such a fantastic presence. And I must admit, once I came here and once I realized that they were interested in me as a candidate to be the next principal, I decided to throw my hat in the ring and try and get the job. And they offered me the job, and here I am. That'll probably do as a start, Naz, and then I've got 3 minutes left out of my 30, so I'll stop the clock and let you ask me any other questions you want to ask me.
Thank you. That's a fantastic story, and it's really motivating to hear that even if you are not born and brought up in a privileged environment, but you can make something out of your life based on your skills, based on your effort, and that's your life example of that. And thank you a lot for sharing your story with us. And I'll ask you a couple of my questions first, and then I'll jump into the questions from the audience. Okay. So I was so curious to know this. Do you think leadership is innate or acquired skill?
It's a very interesting topic, and I mean, I've written articles about leadership and read quite a lot of the leadership literature. I mean, there's this famous phrase that says, "I don't know what leadership is, but I recognize it when I see it."
Yeah.
And I would assign myself to that banner. What I would say is that I think I've learned a lot about how not to do things because I've encountered some people who are terrible leaders, and I've learned a lot of negative lessons, if you like, about if I'm ever in a leadership position, I wouldn't do it that way. You know, I would do it differently or something like that. So I think sometimes you learn both positive and negative lessons. I've also seen some really inspiring leaders, particularly in medicine, because that's where my background was, but also since I've been in my present kind of job, I've seen some university leaders from around the world who are really inspiring. And so I do think you take tips and learn lessons from other people, whether that's enough on its own or whether there's some kind of inherent, I think in order to be a leader, you have to have the desire to lead, and not everybody has that desire. And I think I probably do, and I don't really know why, but if I'm ever in a bunch of people in a situation and no one seems to be prepared to sort it out or take the leadership, I find that very frustrating, and I always feel like I'll be the one that goes and sort of does something about it. So I think some of it might be a touch of arrogance, some of it might be something about self-confidence. I think you need the desire to lead. I think if you have that desire, then I think probably people can learn from both good and bad examples from other people and then develop your leadership skills. But if you don't have the desire in the first place, you probably wouldn't ever get to that point.
Yeah, fantastic. So, and before opening the chat to the audience, I wanted to ask, what sort of legacy do you want to leave behind for at your workplace, like for
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I don't really give much thought to legacy. People talk a lot about legacy and about, what do you want to be remembered for?
yeah.
I've said this to my wife actually. One of my school teachers in a school report wrote that it said, Peter always sets himself high standards and he continues to achieve them. I would put that on my gravestone. Not except I don't want a gravestone because I don't want to be buried. I want to be burnt. But to me, that kind of legacy of someone who tried his best and admitted his failings and learned from his mistakes, that's the kind of legacy personally I think I'd like to leave. And I would be satisfied if my family, I've got 2 children and I've got 2 grandchildren, if they remember me in the future as someone that did his best and was a sort of honest, hardworking individual, then I'd be satisfied with that. In terms of institutional legacy, my main concern when I was president of the University of Hong Kong, and I feel the same about being principal of the University of Edinburgh, is that this is a 430-year-old institution, and the University of Hong Kong is younger. It's only 110 years old, but that's still old for Asia. I feel quite influenced by the fact that I'm only a transient visitor in this role. The university's been here for 100 years before me, and it'll be here for 100 years after me. And so I'll do my best to lead it effectively in the time that I have the privilege of being in the job. But I shouldn't give myself airs about the idea that I can really make an enormous difference to the legacy of a university that's built up its legacy over 430 years. I'm just a transient visitor here, but I try not to screw it up.
Thank you for answering the question of my question. So we've got a lot of questions from our audience, as we've expected earlier. So Harry wants to know that he has started his undergraduate degree at university after living in Hong Kong for about past 2 years. And he wanted to ask you about your experience at Hong Kong University compared to Edinburgh.
So obviously my experience was as a university leader, principal, not as a member of teaching staff or a researcher or indeed a student. So, but I also did have experience as a citizen. I think of Hong Kong as a really exciting place. It's an exciting place both in terms of the day-to-day lifestyle, but also where it is in the world, and the places that you can visit nearby. The fact that it's a multilingual society, the fact that it has the best food in the world, the fact that it's got incredible transport links. There's so many things about Hong Kong that make it a great place. The politics in Hong Kong is complicated, and everything is complicated by politics. So everything is complicated by the relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China and Hong Kong and Britain. And me as a Brit appointed to run the premier university in Hong Kong, obviously that brought political complications. So I certainly had my fair share of complexities there. But I feel, my wife and I both feel very affectionate towards Hong Kong. My wife still misses it. She often says she misses Hong Kong. We've been back there 3 or 4 times since we left, and we always feel pleased to be back. It's a very interesting place to live and a very interesting place to work. The universities in Hong Kong are excellent. Hong Kong has more universities per head of population in the top rankings than any other city on the planet. The only other city which comes close is London, but Hong Kong has more universities in the top rankings than London for a smaller population. And so, the universities, I think, in Hong Kong are disproportionately highly regarded. Of course, in my opinion, the University of Hong Kong is the best of all of them. I would say that, wouldn't I? But it is. It's the oldest. It's got the most diverse staff. It's got the highest reputation. Whilst I was there, it was ranked as the 3rd most international university in the world, and that's something that we were very proud of. So it's a fabulous university full of fabulously talented people, and it's in one of the world's great cities. So I think Hong Kong and the University of Hong Kong have a great deal to offer. The University of Edinburgh, again, I don't need to tell you about the University of Edinburgh. I mean, there were not many places I could have gone from Hong Kong, from the University of Hong Kong, that people would have understood why I wanted to leave to go somewhere else. And people did understand that for me, because of sentimental links with my family roots, and because the University of Edinburgh is a very highly regarded university, people in Hong Kong sort of understood why I might choose to go there. If I'd been going back to Bristol, or if I'd been going to a younger university in Australia or in America, I think people would have wondered why on earth I would leave Hong Kong U to go to those places. But with Edinburgh, they sort of understood. And so, I had personal reasons for coming back to the UK. My mum was in poor health. My daughter-in-law was expecting our first grandson. I had a daughter that never really wanted us to leave the UK in the first place. So I had all sorts of personal reasons for coming back. My wife wasn't able to work in Hong Kong, and I wanted her to be able to work again. So there are lots of personal reasons why it made sense. But I couldn't have left Hong Kong U unless I was going somewhere with the sort of cachet and the expertise and the heritage that Edinburgh has.
Okay, so, and also we've got a question from Andrew. He wants to know why there were never any testing sites open on campus. Other universities such as US and did make it easier to accurately trace outbreaks in halls and courses, and with minimal disruption to healthy students. So can you please elaborate on this topic?
Yeah, of course. Yes, so this would be sorry, I've got a bit of an echo. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah. This has been a topic that we've been discussing actively for months with amongst the university experts, amongst my senior team, and also with the Scottish Government and with the public health authorities. The general view has always been, and still is at the moment, that universities should not run their own testing scheme. What they should do, and what we've tried to do, is contribute to the success of the national testing scheme. So we've offered help in terms of laboratories, in terms of personnel, and in terms of contact tracing and things like that to the national scheme, and we've not set up our own scheme. That's point number one. Point number two is that the Scottish approach, the Scottish Government approach, advised by their public health experts, is that the testing should be focused on symptomatic individuals, on people who have symptoms, not on asymptomatic individuals who might be infected with the virus but wouldn't have any symptoms. Whereas if you're talking about mass screening, then you would screen people whether they're symptomatic or asymptomatic. There are some universities in England that have, and one in Wales, which have started to offer some testing to their students and staff. My understanding from talking to some of these people is that, firstly, the number of tests they're able to do are quite low. They in an ideal world, you would test every student and staff 2 or 3 times a week. We have 55,000 people in our university community. So if we did tests twice a week, that would be 110,000 tests. Most university schemes that are operating in England can do 2,000 or 3,000 tests. They can't do 110,000. So there's a sense that it's a gesture rather than anything terribly effective. And there's also a concern about undermining the national scheme. I mean, if we did tests and we found positives, they would then have to be referred to the NHS. So they'd have to be referred to the NHS anyway, because that's the way it works. The initial tests are sort of a screening test. So what we've concentrated on trying to do is to make sure that students and staff have access to testing when they need it. The Usher Hall site for testing it's not exactly on campus, but it's not very far away. We had lots of discussions with the authorities about whether we could provide a site on campus. We offered 3 or 4 different sites on campus, but in the end they decided that none of them were big enough, and that's why they ended up going for the Usher Hall. And they also felt, and I agreed with them, that we shouldn't have a site that's confined or restricted to university members to use. It should be a public site, because obviously the need for testing should be determined by whether you've got symptoms or not by whether you're a university member or not. So it is still being discussed. There is a possibility that the Scottish Government will do some pilot experiments testing asymptomatic individuals, and we would certainly be willing to be considered as a pilot site if that was available. But the general point is that we don't feel that to set up our own testing scheme would have been much help to either to our community or to the nation as a whole, and we're much better off to work with the national scheme and try and make a success of it as best as we can.
Thanks for answering. So we've got another question. It's anonymous. So they want to know, what are your thoughts on abolishing the teaching unions? Given the value of degrees is demonstrably different, would you support a UK-wide variation to the fee structure?
So can I just clarify the question? Abolish the teaching unions?
Yes.
Do you mean the trade union? Does this person mean the trade unions?
No, they just mentioned teaching union. It's not specific.
I'll answer the second question. I'm not quite sure what the question means. I mean, do I think that teaching unions should be abolished? Well, teaching unions, like all trade unions, are everybody's privilege. If you're a worker in the UK and you want to join a trade union, you should be free to do so. And as an employer, we work with our trade unions because the agreement is that they represent all staff, not just the staff that are members of the union. So quick answer is no, I don't think the teaching union should be abolished, because I think it would make the management of a university much more difficult, and it would make the life of staff much more difficult if they didn't have someone to speak up for their best interests. So quick answer is no, I don't think so, if that was the question. The question about what was, can you just reiterate the question about tuition fees, Jazz? What was it?
Yes, yeah. So, given the value of degree is demonstrably different, would you support a UK-wide variation to the fee structure?
Well, I mean, obviously at the moment there is a UK-wide variation to the fee structure in that Scottish Government prefers a system whereby students domiciled in Scotland don't pay tuition fees up front, and their tuition costs are underwritten by the Scottish Government. Whereas in England, the amount of underwriting is very much less than it used to be, and most students do pay tuition fees. So there's already some variation within the UK. When I'm asked questions about this, my answer is always the same. I can work to try and provide high quality higher education as long as it's adequately funded. If you want a high quality product, it's got to be properly funded. And I can work with a system where that funding comes primarily from tuition fees from individual students, or whether it comes primarily as a block grant from government. As long as the funding is adequate to provide a high quality product, I think we can adapt. The other area of tuition fees which causes controversy is the relationship between home fees and international fees. And home fees are capped. So for Scotland, it's underwritten by Scottish Government, as I've said, and for England and the rest of the UK, it's capped at 9,250, whereas international fees are not capped. So international fees can be set at higher levels by individual universities according to demand and according to their valuation of the course offerings. And that has the consequence that universities can generate surplus on international student tuition. And we do, and other universities like us do. And we're a non-profit organization, so it's not a question about making profit, but we have to cross-subsidize some of the other things that we want to do by producing surplus income from somewhere, because we don't get adequate funding for teaching of home students, and we don't get adequate funding for our research. And so we have to have a cross subsidy in order to do the things that we want to do. And we also have to have a we also have to have a surplus if we want to be able to reinvest in the university. So if we want to build new student accommodation, or we want to build a new teaching block or a new research block, the money has to come from somewhere. We have to generate it ourselves. Although there are sources of external funding that we can apply for, in general, they're hard to get, and we have to generate our own funding. So the only way we can invest in the future of the university is by generating a surplus. And for us, there are only really two activities that generate a surplus. One is international student tuition fees, and the other one is accommodation, catering, and events. So, running conferences, providing accommodation for the fringe and the festival, etc., etc. That generates some surplus that we can reinvest. So international students do generate a surplus because they pay higher fees. That helps us to run the university. If we wanted to get away from that situation, we'd have to have more funding from somewhere else, because otherwise we can't make the university the effective organization that we want to make it. So there are already differentials between England and Scotland, and there are already differentials between home students and international students, and we can work within that system. If the system changed, I'm confident we could make it work, but obviously the parameters would be different.
Following up from that question, Domenico wants to ask, so given there is a steeper university fee structure, do you think it would prevent students from low income backgrounds internationally to come to have the university experience? And how are you trying to tackle with that issue?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So, and I mean, the quick answer is yes, that's a real concern. So we within Scotland, we make enormous efforts to level the playing field for students from less advantaged backgrounds, and we do that in all sorts of ways, with contextual offers and with the most generous scholarship scheme that any university in the UK has, and all sorts of measures to try and improve the ability of people from less advantaged backgrounds in Scotland to be able to come here. We do some of that also in the rest of the UK with scholarships and bursaries. We don't do very much of it internationally as things currently stand, and most of our international students are able to come because they're able to either provide funding themselves or have support of governments or scholarships or other bursaries. So I would love to provide more assistance to students from disadvantaged backgrounds to come here. We are already doing what I think is we're part of what is a really pioneering scheme in Hong Kong, where there's a foundation in Hong Kong, that people that I happen to know from when I worked there, who identify students from disadvantaged backgrounds and help them to apply to universities both in Hong Kong and outside Hong Kong, and in some cases help them to find sponsorship or scholarship support. We're working with that foundation, and we're aiming to make the University of Edinburgh a university of choice for those students. Now that requires us to fundraise, and we're doing that actively both in Hong Kong and in the UK. So we're making a start on that. I was also talking today to a person I won't name for reasons of confidentiality, but I was talking to somebody about India, and about this person runs a foundation that seeks to provide educational opportunities for young people in rural India. Again, we've already got a couple of students from that foundation, sponsored by that foundation, but they're looking to expand their program. So we're doing it in small numbers. The other continent which captivates me, and actually I didn't talk about when I talked about my life story, but I have spent a number of years going to parts of Africa to teach, particularly Uganda, but also some other parts of Africa. And I have a particular affection for East Africa. And I would love to be able to provide opportunity to some of the people in East Africa that won't otherwise get access to tertiary education. Again, it requires funding and it requires infrastructure, but we're thinking about the way we can do that. We've got a wonderful program with the MasterCard Foundation that brings students from mostly sub-Saharan Africa here to Edinburgh. There are only 2 universities outside North America that are part of that scheme, and we're one of them. And that brings very talented students from Africa. But unfortunately, the numbers in all of these schemes, Hong Kong, and Africa, and all the numbers are small, and India, they're all small. So I'd love to expand that, but at the moment we don't do as much for international students from disadvantaged backgrounds as we do from home students, and I certainly have the ambition to try and improve that.
Thank you. It's an anonymous question again. So somebody wants to know that, do you think, and how does the merger with ECA went? So I'm not sure what's the word ECA actually means.
I understand that question. So ECA is Edinburgh College of Art. And before I arrived here, this merger took place. So in the past, Edinburgh College of Art was a separate institution, and a decision was made by the people, the respective leaders of the two organisations several years ago, to bring the Edinburgh College of Art into the University of Edinburgh. So it's now one of our biggest, if not the biggest, school within the University of Edinburgh. In terms of how I think the merger went, I'm aware that there are still some people that feel that it wasn't the right thing to do, that the Edinburgh College of Art somehow lost its identity when it got absorbed into the University of Edinburgh. My understanding of the decision making at the time, and as I say, it was several years before I came, so I can only talk about what I've heard from others. But my understanding is that there were real pressing financial reasons why the Edinburgh College of Art wasn't able to continue on its own, and the feeling that it would be in the best interests of the college, and indeed the best interests of the university, for the two to merge. My task is to help to continue to make it a success. There are some fabulously talented people at Edinburgh College of Art. I visited the college myself a week ago, and I spoke to some of the staff and some of the students, because I've been going around some of the schools trying to understand how people are coping with the current very challenging circumstances. And the sort of creativity and the energy that people at the Edinburgh College of Art have is really inspiring. So I think it's a fabulous college. I think it can add enormously to the university, because there are so many interdisciplinary things that can be done between other disciplines and the disciplines in the Edinburgh College of Art, that I happen to believe that that it was the right thing to do, and that we can make a success of it. But I know there are some people that are still concerned about it.
And also in the second part of the question, they've asked, should academics still be running universities in a corporate age?
That's a really good question. I mean, I don't know the answer, and I'm probably not the right person to judge, because I'm obviously one of them. But the reason I got promoted into leadership positions was because I'd had some successes as a researcher or as a teacher, not because I was necessarily a proven administrator. And that very often happens in universities. Okay, then I was given a small task with a small department, and then because that went well, I then got a bigger task with an entire faculty, and then I got a bigger task with an entire university, and then I moved to an even bigger university. So so I have sort of stepped up in terms of the scale of the challenge that I've taken on. But and I suppose along the way I've learned some skills, and I've learned some some lessons that I think are helpful to me. But I was never really trained as an institutional leader. And there are certainly some American universities. There've been one or two British ones, not very many, but there've been quite a lot of American universities that would appoint a business executive to be their president. They're not an academic. I think the general view in the university world is still that universities are academic institutions, and they should be best run by academics. But there's certainly a challenge to that, with the sense that there are a lot of business skills required, and communication skills and managerial skills that academics don't necessarily have. All I can say is that the way I've addressed that is by working with specialists. And so for example, I have a director of finance here who knows more about finance than I ever will. And although I know a bit about it, I've got an expert that I can turn to when there's a specialist need. And I have the same for various other legal or information technology, or particular aspects of teaching or research. I have lots of people I can call on if there's areas that I don't have the expertise in. So I think running a university is a teamwork job. It's not about any single individual. And I personally believe, again, of course I would say this, wouldn't I? I personally believe that academic institutions should be led by people who understand academic issues, not by business people who don't understand academic issues. I think if you have someone that understands both, then that's terrific. But those people are not very common.
Yeah, thank you. And Ali wants to know, will you ever return to working in medicine ever again?
The honest answer is probably not. It makes me sad to admit it, but I am still registered with the General Medical Council, although I'm not registered to practice at the moment because I haven't practiced for 6 years, and so therefore I would be regarded as someone that needed some retraining. I think I still could do it. I'd certainly still enjoy it, but the reality is that I don't really have time. It's my present job is a busy one, and I wouldn't want to do it part-time and not do it properly. So I think the harsh reality is that I probably won't go back to it. If I get sacked tomorrow as the principal, or tonight maybe, then that would be one career option for me, but I would have to do some retraining. I certainly love medicine and enjoy it, and I think I could be happy going back to it, but I think the reality is that it's unlikely.
Okay, thank you. And for last question for our today's session is from Harry. He wants to know, did you ever meet Li Ka-shing? If you did, what was your experience of meeting him?
Yes, I did meet Li Ka-shing, and Li Ka-shing's a very interesting man. He's quite elderly now, and looks quite frail. He's old, and you would say that he's not very strong in terms of looking at him, but my goodness, he's a strong and effective businessman. And in Hong Kong, there are some remarkable people who are very elderly who still continue to run multi-billion-dollar businesses, often with international connections. And I did meet many of them. Li Ka-shing is one of the most famous. He's very much a friend of education and of universities. So whilst I was at the University of Hong Kong, we certainly received philanthropic support from him and his foundation. And I heard just the other day that he's recently made donations to all of the universities in Hong Kong at a time when universities in Hong Kong have been going through a very bad spell. And so they're very grateful to get the support. So my dealings with Li Ka-shing were mostly about education, not about business. I mean, he runs these massive businesses, a container port and a huge communications business. And I never really had much to do with him with those hats on, but with the education hat on, I did talk to him, and I was grateful for his support.
And thank you. And I'm aware of the time, so unfortunately I can't take any more questions. So are there any final words you would like to say to our new students at our university in this unprecedented period?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I'd love to talk for an hour to them. I mean, so firstly, just thank you very much for the opportunity, Jazz and Harrison. It's been interesting for me to hear your questions and to talk a bit about my own experience. My message to both new and continuing students at the University of Edinburgh is, first of all, congratulations on getting here, because it's not straightforward. The competition is very stiff. We have 10 applications for every place that we can fill. So you've already got a marker of distinction on your CV by getting here in the first place. So well done for that. Secondly, make the most of the opportunity that you've earned yourself. We in the university do our best to try and provide an environment where people can flourish, and it's entirely up to you how much you make of it. And you will get out what you put in. If you enjoy it and you apply yourself, you will succeed, and you'll have a degree from the University of Edinburgh, which will be a passport to success for the rest of your lives, because the University of Edinburgh is a very highly regarded university on the world stage. I think it's a great sadness that some people are having to start their first university life in the first university year in the present circumstances. And for those of you that are not in your first year, clearly this year is going to be different from any other year. There are limitations on your lifestyle, there are limitations on how you get your teaching and how you get your personal development and everything else, which I think we all regret. But the fact is that we don't have control of the external events. We have to respond in a way that is governed by consideration of people's health and safety, and we're trying to do the best we can to make the experience as good as it can possibly be. I hope, and I want to finish on a note of optimism, it's not always going to be like this. Boris Johnson today said that he's sick of the virus, and I think probably we all agree with that. We're sick of it, and we're sick of the way it's affecting our ability to function, and it's the way it's affecting our personal and our professional lives. It will eventually go away or be managed better, more effectively than it has been when it was a new virus, and we will eventually emerge out the other side. I don't know when that's going to be, but in the meantime, the University of Edinburgh will do its very best to provide the best possible experience that it can for its students. And I think Edinburgh is a fantastic city, and this is a great university, and I welcome everybody that's new to the university, and I wish them all the very best for the future.
And thank you very much for taking your precious time with us this evening. And please keep in touch. And thanks a lot. And on that note, I think we can end our session now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It's great to have you on.
Thanks for the invitation, Harrison, and all the very best to you and the entrepreneurs.
Cheers.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.